The hammer of God. The arrival and immediate devastation of the 14th century plague. The year is 1347. Europe, despite its fragmentation, stands at the peak of the Middle Ages, stabilized by the rigid hierarchy of the feudal system and the overwhelming spiritual authority of the Catholic Church. Cities are growing, trade routes are expanding, and life, while harsh, is predictable. Then, from the vast unknown reaches of the East, aboard flea-infested trade ships arriving in the port of Messina, Sicily, came an invisible, terrifying force that would shatter this stability: the Black Death. This was not just an illness, it was a societal cataclysm, a demographic shockwave that would eventually claim the lives of between 30% and 60% of Europe's total population in just 4 short years. The speed and ruthlessness of the plague, caused by the Yersinia pestis bacterium, were unprecedented. Victims often went to bed healthy and were dead by morning, succumbing to the horrific symptoms of buboes, fever, and coughing up blood. To the 14th century mind, this was not a medical event. It was the hammer of God, divine punishment for the sins of man, or perhaps worse, a deliberate, malevolent act orchestrated by hidden forces. The chaos, fear, and religious mania that gripped the continent were the perfect cover for a transfer of power and wealth on a scale that had no historical precedent. Before the plague, European society was defined by a rigid, unchanging order. The vast majority of the population were serfs, tied to the land owned by the nobility. Labor was cheap, and the power of the landowning elite was absolute, maintained by tradition and reinforced by the church. The economy was based on agricultural surplus, and the movement of wealth and people was heavily restricted. This system was designed to be virtually unbreakable, ensuring that the few remained wealthy and the many remained subservient. The plague, however, introduced the only element that could possibly break the feudal chains: scarcity of labor. When half or more of the workforce died, the entire economic model collapsed. Suddenly, for the first time in centuries, the surviving peasant held leverage. A farmer could demand higher wages, refuse servitude, and simply move to another village where land was available and labor was desperately needed. This forced social mobility was the crack in the feudal foundation. But the speed with which certain powerful individuals and institutions adapted to and capitalized on this collapse suggests more than mere spontaneous reaction. While the common people were dying, the early stages of the pandemic saw a disturbing pattern. Certain elite groups, particularly high-ranking members of the church and influential financiers, who understood trade routes and city closures, often found ways to isolate themselves or relocate their most valuable assets. Furthermore, the immense fear led to an immediate search for scapegoats. Jews, foreigners, and the poor were immediately targeted in widespread pogroms, their property seized and their debts canceled. A violent, organized process that allowed for the sudden, rapid liquidation of capital by those who executed the mob justice. This initial devastation, fueled by fear and religious terror, was the necessary prerequisite for the second, more subtle phase of the conspiracy: the engineered social reset. The immediate death toll was the tragedy. The long-term, deliberate restructuring of wealth and power was the calculated consequence. In the following parts, we will peel back the historical layers to reveal how the economic vacuum was filled, and how the survivors among the powerful used death itself as the ultimate tool for revolutionizing the European class structure and consolidating true financial control. The Great Wealth Transfer: how the church and nobles seized lands and canceled debts. The catastrophic loss of life inflicted by the Black Death between 1347 and 1351 created an immediate and unprecedented financial crisis in Europe. However, this crisis was not shared equally. While the vast majority of the dead were the landless urban poor and peasants, the power vacuum created an extraordinary opportunity for the institutional and aristocratic elites to execute a great wealth transfer, consolidating land and capital through legally questionable means. This action was crucial to the long-term conspiracy, ensuring that the feudal system, though weakened, did not collapse entirely into anarchy, but was instead reformed under the control of a smaller, more financially dominant group. The primary mechanism for this consolidation was the sheer number of deaths among the landowning class and the subsequent legal complications of inheritance. If a wealthy landlord died without direct heirs, a common occurrence when entire families were wiped out, their property, including the land, livestock, and associated feudal rights, often reverted not to distant relatives, but to the nearest feudal lord or the Catholic Church. The Church in particular was a massive beneficiary. Already Europe's largest landowner, the Church quickly and aggressively laid claim to properties where ownership was ambiguous. Furthermore, widespread panic led to massive donations and bequests from the dying, who desperately sought to secure a place in heaven. Faced with imminent death, nobles and merchants bequeathed large sums of money, precious objects, and entire estates to monasteries and bishoprics. This fear-driven transfer significantly increased the Church's real estate holdings and liquid wealth, making it an even more dominant economic and political force in the immediate aftermath of the plague. The Church utilized its spiritual authority to justify this massive accumulation of wealth, the ultimate act of capitalizing on mass human suffering. Simultaneously, the plague caused a radical disruption in the system of debt and credit. In a society where lending was central to commerce, often handled by Jewish financiers, who were simultaneously being persecuted, the death of debtors created chaos. While some debts were simply erased due to the demise of the entire family line, other, more strategic debts were selectively canceled or seized by the state or the wealthy elite. By selectively forgiving smaller, uncollectible debts while aggressively pursuing larger, more valuable ones, the elite effectively restructured the financial landscape, weeding out competitors and strengthening the balance sheets of their own enterprises. The most profound shift occurred in the agricultural sector. With the peasant population decimated, the value of land plummeted, while the cost of labor skyrocketed. While this initially benefited the surviving peasants, as detailed in Part 1, the great feudal lords and the crown quickly sought to reverse this trend. They used their political power to issue ordinances, such as the Statute of Laborers in England, 1351, which attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels, making it illegal for peasants to demand higher pay or move freely. Although these laws were often unenforceable in the long term, they demonstrated the powerful elite's immediate, concerted effort to suppress the economic gains of the survivors and maintain the traditional wealth disparity. In summary, the Black Death provided a financial purge. The sudden violent removal of a huge portion of the population allowed institutional powers, the Church, and the highest nobility to bypass conventional legal processes and accumulate vast, undisputed tracts of land and capital from the dead. This was not merely recovery. It was a strategic re-feudalization of wealth, setting the stage for the next phase of the conspiracy. Using this concentrated wealth to finance the political and economic revolution that followed. The manufactured crisis, how labor scarcity led to peasant revolts and royal crackdowns. Following the initial horror and the subsequent consolidation of land by the elite, as detailed in Part 2, the Black Death entered its most politically volatile phase. The surviving population, having witnessed the vulnerability of the old order and realizing the new value of their labor, began to demand fundamental economic and social change. This demand was met not with negotiation, but with a deliberate, coordinated effort by the crown and the nobility to manufacture a social crisis, an environment of civil unrest that justified brutal state repression, which ultimately served to re-establish the elite's dominance. The core of the crisis was the clash between economic reality and legal decree. Economically, the survivors' wages should have tripled due to the extreme scarcity of workers. However, the ruling powers, desperate to prevent the collapse of the feudal land valuation system, quickly imposed laws like the English Statute of Laborers, 1351, which mandated pre-plague wages and made it illegal for peasants to travel or refuse work. These decrees were a clear act of class warfare, attempting to legally enslave the workforce that nature had just freed. This attempted reversal of economic fate fueled widespread resentment, leading to a decade of escalating tension and culminating in massive violent peasant uprisings across Europe. The most famous of these were the Jacquerie in France, 1358, and the Peasants' Revolt in England, 1381. These revolts were not spontaneous riots over food. They were organized political acts, demanding the abolition of serfdom, the dismantling of restrictive labor laws, and the seizure of church wealth, a direct threat to the foundations of the established power structure. The ruling elite, including the monarchs and the highest-ranking nobles, used the sheer brutality and scope of these revolts as their greatest strategic advantage. The chaos provided the perfect pretext for overwhelming state violence. In the aftermath of the Peasants' Revolt, the young King Richard II initially appeared to grant concessions, agreeing to abolish serfdom. However, once the peasant armies dispersed, the crown immediately reneged on its promises. The subsequent royal crackdown was swift and merciless. Leaders of the revolt, such as Wat Tyler in England and Guillaume Caille in France, were executed in the most brutal public spectacles imaginable, designed to send an unambiguous message of terror to the surviving population. The state employed professional armies to sweep the countryside, not just punishing the participants, but systematically reimposing fines, taxes, and feudal obligations on those who had benefited from the post-plague labor scarcity. This manufactured crisis, engineered by restrictive labor laws and then violently suppressed, served several strategic purposes for the conspiracy. 1. Re-establishing authority. It reminded the surviving population, who had briefly tasted freedom, that state power and the capacity for systematic violence was still absolute, overriding economic reality. Weakening local nobility. While crushing the peasants, the crown also strategically weakened the power of local feudal lords who had failed to control their workforce, centralizing military and legal authority under the monarchy. Justifying taxation. The cost of suppressing the revolts and rebuilding the shattered military structures justified the imposition of new, harsh poll taxes, like the ones that triggered the English Revolt, ensuring that the economic burden of the crisis was placed firmly back onto the poor. The crisis of the Black Death thus became a controlled explosion. The powerful allowed the initial devastation to clear the board, seize the assets of the dead, provoke the desperate survivors into open rebellion through oppressive laws, and then use the resulting chaos to justify a wave of repression that not only crushed the rebellion, but solidified the new financial and legal reality, accelerating the shift toward a centralized monarchical state where power was based less on ancient feudal ties and more on readily available financial capital. The new financiers, how merchant families and Italian bankers exploited the power vacuum, while the crown and the traditional nobility focused their energy on crushing peasant revolts and enforcing outdated labor laws, as discussed in Part 3. A far more subtle and ultimately more powerful shift was occurring among the economic actors who dealt in liquid capital rather than land. The Black Death created an unprecedented liquidity crisis, which the burgeoning class of Italian merchant bankers and major Northern European trading families did not merely survive. They exploited it to vault themselves from regional prominence to central control over the continent's finance. This financial elite became the ultimate beneficiaries of the Black Death conspiracy, quietly laying the groundwork for the Renaissance and the modern capitalist state. The plague fundamentally shifted the basis of European wealth from land to capital. Land, previously the source of all wealth and power, was now cheap due to the labor scarcity. Conversely, liquid cash, specie, gold, and access to credit became exponentially more valuable, as they were required to pay the vastly increased wages of the surviving workforce, finance the rebuilding of cities, and fund the crown's expensive military operations against internal rebellions. The key players to exploit this transformation were the great banking houses of Italy, the Medici of Florence, and the trading guilds of Venice and Genoa. Unlike the feudal lords, these families were already masters of complex finance, fractional reserve banking, and international credit networks. When the traditional, smaller municipal banks across Europe failed during the economic shock, the Italian houses, with their deeper capital reserves and wider reach, stepped in to fill the void. They became the indispensable source of credit for cash-strapped monarchs and nobility. The conspiracy element here lies in the exploitation of desperation. Kings, needing immediate cash to suppress revolts and consolidate new territories, became deeply indebted to these sophisticated financiers. The bankers did not merely charge high interest, they demanded collateral in the form of royal monopolies, control over tax collection rights, and access to key trade ports. This effectively transferred political power, the right to collect royal revenue, from the Crown's administration directly to private merchant banking families. By controlling the Crown's purse strings, the bankers gained an unprecedented political influence that transcended their previous social status. Furthermore, the plague's chaos allowed the successful merchant families to eliminate their commercial competition. The death rate among the skilled artisans, small merchants, and trade agents was exceptionally high. The surviving large trading consortiums, who had the infrastructure and capital to endure the interruption, were able to buy up the assets and market shares of their dead rivals for pennies on the dollar. This resulted in the consolidation of trade routes and the establishment of powerful monopolies in commodities like wool, textiles, and spices. Wealth became concentrated in fewer hands, accelerating the destruction of the competitive market and creating the first true European oligarchies. This shift marks the true, lasting legacy of the Black Death as a geopolitical conspiracy. The plague violently cleared the old feudal order, not for anarchy or peasant freedom, but for a new financial elite who understood that in the new post-plague reality, control of credit and capital was vastly superior to the control of mere land. They used the crisis of mass death to fundamentally re-engineer the European economy, replacing the old system of land-based power with the new system of credit-based power, establishing the financial architecture that would eventually lead to the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. The spiritual purge, the Church's crisis of authority, and the rise of secular power. The greatest challenge to the stability of the 14th century was not just economic or social, but spiritual. For centuries, the Catholic Church had held absolute, unquestionable authority over the minds and souls of Europeans, acting as the ultimate guarantor of the social order. When the Black Death struck, the Church's response and devastating failure triggered a deep crisis of faith that fundamentally weakened its power, allowing the secular state and the emerging financial elite to step into the massive spiritual void. This transfer of ultimate moral authority was a crucial, intentional outcome of the overall conspiracy. The Church's failure was twofold: theological and practical. Theological failure. The Church preached that the plague was divine punishment, yet their prayers and rituals proved utterly ineffective against the disease. Why would a loving God punish the righteous along with the wicked? More damningly, why were the most pious, the monks, nuns, and dedicated parish priests, dying in numbers equal to, or often greater than, the rest of the population? The spiritual explanation offered by the Church simply did not match the observable, brutal reality. The power of indulgences, paying for forgiveness, once the Church's greatest financial leverage, lost its currency when death came swiftly, randomly, and equally to the rich and the poor, the pious and the wicked. Practical failure. When fear reached its peak, the ecclesiastical structure itself began to fail. Priests refused to administer last rites to the sick, fearing contagion. Monasteries, which should have been sanctuaries, often sealed their doors, refusing to help the suffering. This perceived abandonment by the spiritual leaders was a profound betrayal. In their absence, brave but often untrained, laymen and even women stepped forward to offer comfort, proving that salvation did not require the formal authority of the official clergy. This demonstrated for the first time on a massive scale that the institutional church was fallible, self-interested, and ultimately mortal. This collapse of spiritual legitimacy opened the door for secular power, the kings and the new merchant elite, to gain moral ground. Monarchs, despite their own failures, could at least claim to be actively suppressing the chaos, enforcing order and protecting the state, a more tangible form of salvation than the Church could offer. This shift accelerated the rise of proto-nationalism and the idea that the state, not the Pope, was the ultimate guardian of the people's welfare. The ultimate act of consolidation in this spiritual purge was the seizure of monastic wealth. While the church successfully accumulated land from dying nobles, as seen in Part 2, the sheer number of abandoned or depleted monasteries left vast amounts of gold, silver, and liquid assets vulnerable. As the financial elite, the bankers and merchants, gained influence over cash-strapped monarchs, they encouraged and financed the slow, strategic process of secularizing some of this wealth, transferring control of assets from independent religious orders to the crown. This process, which dramatically reduced the church's economic and political independence, paved the way for later, more dramatic breaks with Rome, such as the Reformation centuries later. The Black Death, therefore, acted as a spiritual cleansing fire. It did not kill the Christian faith, but it fatally wounded the institutional authority of the Catholic Church. By destroying the old feudal order and simultaneously discrediting the church, the plague cleared the stage for the new elite, the centralized monarchies and their financier allies, who based their power not on divine right or land, but on the tangible, secular tools of finance, state control, and military might. The age of absolute papal authority was over. The age of centralized, financially backed state power was just beginning. The New World Order, the long-term engineered shifts towards capitalism and centralization, the immediate chaos of the Black Death, 1347-1351, gave way to a century of deep-seated systemic change. The conspiracy, which began with the opportunistic seizing of land and the suppression of peasant labor, culminated in a long-term geopolitical and economic restructuring that permanently dissolved the medieval world and laid the undeniable foundation for modern capitalism and centralized state power. This was the true final phase of the engineered collapse, the replacement of a decentralized faith-based economy with a centralized finance-based one. The fundamental shift was driven by the new reality of centralized royal finance. As explored in Part 4, the kings became deeply indebted to the new Italian and Northern European merchant bankers. This debt was not a weakness for the monarchs. Paradoxically, it was a source of strength. By relying on complex international loans rather than local feudal taxes, kings could bypass the traditional, decentralized power of their nobles. The monarchy evolved from being the apex of the feudal pyramid to the financial executor of the state, directly empowered by the liquid capital of the new elite. This centralization was made possible by two key developments accelerated by the plague. 1. The rise of bureaucracy and taxation. To service the massive debts owed to the bankers and to maintain control over the newly restive population, monarchs created professional, centralized tax bureaucracies. These new administrative bodies were efficient, impersonal, and bypassed local aristocratic control. The money collected was no longer primarily used to fund local feudal armies, but to fund standing royal armies and pay interest to the banking houses. This system of debt-driven centralization created a far more powerful and resilient state than the fragmented feudal system could ever have been. The manufacturing boom and the birth of capitalism. The soaring cost of labor meant that, in the long run, landowners and entrepreneurs had to innovate. To make up for the loss of cheap manpower, there was a massive investment in labor-saving technology and specialization. Fields were consolidated, manufacturing processes were streamlined, and commercial agriculture began to replace subsistence farming. This desperate need for efficiency, forced by the sudden expense of post-plague labor, spurred technological advancement and market consolidation. Wealth flowed not to those who merely owned the land, but to those who could efficiently manage and innovate the production process, the core definition of early capitalism. Furthermore, the spiritual crisis, Part 5, had secularized much of the social landscape. The massive wealth accumulated by the church and secularized by the monarchy was now free to be invested in the burgeoning, profit-driven ventures of the merchant class. This injection of capital, freed from traditional religious restrictions, financed the early explorations, trade monopolies, and colonial ventures that would ultimately define the age of exploration. The money seized from the old order was systematically funneled into the new, globalized, capital-intensive economy. The ultimate conspiracy was not to cause the plague, which was a natural phenomenon, but to ensure that the inevitable collapse of the feudal system was managed and controlled by a small, interconnected elite monarchs, high nobility, and bankers, who ensured that the resulting freedom of the survivors, the peasants, was short-lived. By centralizing the state, creating debt-based dependencies, and accelerating the shift to a capitalist economic model, the elite effectively traded one form of control, feudal servitude, for a far more efficient and scalable form of control, financial and systemic dependency. The Black Death served as the ultimate violent reset button, used by the powerful to initiate the modern era on their own terms. The enduring legacy, how the plague's political and financial lessons apply to the modern world. The Black Death, centuries after its initial devastation, remains one of the most powerful case studies in history regarding the relationship between catastrophe, governance, and the consolidation of power. The seven-part narrative of the Black Death conspiracy is not about whether the plague was intentionally created, it was a natural disaster, but about the intentional, opportunistic, and strategic exploitation of the resulting collapse by the established elite. The actions taken between 1347 and 1450 provide a chillingly relevant blueprint for how massive, sudden crises are used to execute systemic change that benefits the few, a lesson that resonates profoundly with modern geopolitics and finance. The ultimate conclusion of the Black Death conspiracy rests on three enduring, repeating lessons for state power and financial control. 1. The crisis as catalyst for centralization. The plague destroyed the local, decentralized power structures of feudalism. This was immediately replaced by centralized monarchical authority, Part 6. The elite realized that a large, fragmented population is difficult to control, but a smaller, centralized and financially dependent population is highly manageable. Every major subsequent crisis in history, from world wars to modern pandemics, has been followed by an accelerated push towards centralized governance, increased state surveillance, and greater reliance on international financial institutions, mirroring the post-plague shift from local taxes to royal debt. The crisis is used to justify the necessary step toward greater control, the perpetual wealth transfer. The economic reality of the Black Death, the sudden massive death toll, led to an immediate, forced transfer of wealth and assets from the many, the dying, to the few. The church, the crown, and the major merchant families, Part 2 and 4. This pattern is a historical constant. During major financial crashes, wars, or public health emergencies, capital is rapidly liquidated and bought up by those with the deepest reserves. The Black Death established the playbook. Crises remove competitors. Reserves acquire assets. The resulting wealth gap becomes exponentially wider, transitioning wealth not horizontally, but vertically. The manufactured consent and control. The initial peasant freedom, due to labor scarcity, was instantly nullified by state-imposed wage controls, statute of laborers, and then violently crushed through royal crackdowns, justified by the chaos the laws themselves helped to create. Part 3. This cycle, oppressive legislation leading to revolt, which then justifies brutal state repression, is a classic authoritarian maneuver. By framing dissent as a threat to societal order, the elite secure the public's consent, or resignation, to the re-establishment of rigid, often financial control. The control shifts from physical chains to systemic, legal, and financial dependency. The legacy of the Black Death is therefore not the death toll itself, but the birth of a system where financial capital is the true sovereign. The old world's power was based on lineage and faith. The new world's power, ushered in by the plague, was based on debt and liquid assets. The Italian bankers financing the kings became the true power brokers, a blueprint for the transnational financial dynasties that would later emerge and control global policy. In the end, the Black Death conspiracy serves as a crucial historical warning. When massive unforeseen crises strike, the question should not be focused solely on the nature of the catastrophe, but on who is best positioned to benefit from the resulting instability and who has the political and financial resources to manage the subsequent societal collapse. The men who built the New World after the plague were the quiet administrators, the financiers, and the strategic monarchs who understood that the greatest opportunity for power consolidation often arises from the deepest human tragedy. They did not prevent the death. They simply made sure they profited from the funeral.